It was October 23rd, 1990, a Tuesday morning in New York City. The kind of crisp autumn day when the air feels sharp and the sidewalks are painted with falling leaves. In the heart of Manhattan, on the Upper East Side, a man walked down the street carrying grocery bags. To most people, he looked like an ordinary New Yorker beginning his day. But this man was no ordinary New Yorker. His name was George Kogan, a millionaire businessman known for his energy, his charm, and his ability to turn simple ventures into successful enterprises. At 49 years old, he had wealth, connections, and a new chance at happiness. But that morning, he had no idea he was being followed. The shots came suddenly. Witnesses later described the sound as deafening, echoing against the tall buildings around East 69th Street. 3 gunshots, fast and merciless. George staggered, the bags falling from his hands, oranges rolling across the pavement, bread tumbling out of its paper wrapper. He collapsed onto the sidewalk, blood staining the pavement beneath him, his life bleeding out on a busy Manhattan street as strangers screamed and ran for cover. By the time emergency responders arrived, George was still alive, but barely clinging on. He was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was too severe. Within hours, he was gone. The city that never sleeps barely paused for breath. But for those who knew George, for those who loved him, time had stopped. News traveled fast. A millionaire gunned down in broad daylight in one of the safest, wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. It was shocking. Who would kill George Kogan? And why? That was the question everyone was asking. But for investigators, the answer didn't take long to take shape. They didn't need to look far. George had been in the middle of a bitter divorce from his wife, Barbara. To outsiders, George and Barbara Kogan had once looked like the perfect Manhattan couple. They had built a life of wealth and comfort. George was a self-made man who had worked hard to provide his family with luxury. Barbara was his glamorous wife, a woman who knew how to dress, how to host, how to hold her place in the elite social circles of New York. Together, they seemed untouchable. But behind the glossy photographs and the carefully curated image, the truth was darker. The Kogans' marriage had been crumbling for years. George had fallen out of love with Barbara and into the arms of another woman, a younger interior designer who brought him warmth and affection. He had moved out, starting over, while Barbara was left behind, seething in anger and fear. Divorce was not just about love ending. It was about money, property, and power. For Barbara, it meant losing everything that defined her. People who knew her described her as obsessed with status. Barbara loved the identity of being a millionaire's wife. The designer clothes, the grand apartment, the parties, the vacations. It wasn't just luxury. It was her entire sense of self. Without George's wealth, she would have to face a different life, one without the admiration and envy she had grown used to. And to make matters worse, George had begun making plans to rewrite his will, ensuring that his future with his new partner would leave Barbara with less than she expected. That was Barbara's breaking point. To her, George wasn't just leaving her, he was taking her world away. Detectives soon learned that George's murder wasn't a random act of violence. Witnesses said the gunman seemed prepared, focused. He wasn't trying to rob George. He wasn't panicked. This was a hit, a planned execution in broad daylight. And if it was a contract killing, the first question was, who ordered it? The person who stood to gain the most from George's death was the woman who had everything to lose in his life, Barbara. As police dug deeper, Barbara's name came up again and again. She had been working with a lawyer named Manuel Martinez. a man who wasn't just her attorney but also her accomplice. He had arranged the killer, the hired gun who carried out the plan for cash. Barbara had supplied the money. Martinez had made the connections, and the hitman had pulled the trigger. It was as cold and calculated as it sounded. But in those first few days after the murder, Barbara acted shocked, devastated, even horrified. To the public, she played the role of the grieving wife, but investigators weren't convinced. Her calmness seemed unnatural, her reactions rehearsed, and the deeper they looked, the more the financial motive became clear. With George gone, Barbara had access to his insurance money, his estate, his fortune. Yet, despite the suspicion, the case didn't move quickly. Evidence was hard to pin down, witnesses were scarce, and the hired killer had vanished. Barbara's wealth and connections gave her room to breathe, to deny, to wait out the storm. For George's family, that waiting was unbearable. His girlfriend, broken with grief, couldn't stop replaying their last morning together. His children, torn between the love they once had for their mother and the horror of what she might have done, struggled with anger and betrayal. The murder of George Kogan had all the elements of a story that New Yorkers whispered about over dinner tables: money, power, betrayal, and a killing carried out in broad daylight. But for those closest to George, it wasn't just a story. It was the devastating loss of a father, a partner, a man who should have had decades left to live. And as months turned into years, the question remained: would Barbara ever face justice? For weeks after the murder, the Upper East Side buzzed with speculation. People in George's neighborhood spoke in hushed voices about the man who had been shot down in broad daylight while carrying his groceries. The idea that a contract killing could unfold on those pristine streets was almost unthinkable. The tabloids had a field day. They called it the Millionaire murder, splashing George's face across front pages. The public wanted answers, and the police wanted justice. But behind closed doors, the investigation was struggling to keep pace with the outrage. The first challenge was the nature of the crime itself. Hired killings are designed to leave little behind. The gunman had vanished, blending into the city's endless crowds. No security cameras captured his face clearly. The weapon was never recovered. All investigators had were fragments. Eyewitness accounts of a man fleeing, the sound of 3 shots, and a victim who had been specifically targeted. Random violence didn't fit. Someone had ordered this. Almost immediately, suspicion turned toward Barbara. The detectives didn't need to stretch their imaginations. Her motive was clear. Divorce papers were on the table. Her millionaire lifestyle was at stake. And George's new relationship threatened to rewrite his future without her in it. Friends of the couple had plenty to say. They described Barbara as bitter, controlling, unwilling to let go. Some recalled conversations where she expressed rage about George's new partner, how humiliated she felt being replaced. One neighbor even remembered Barbara saying that if George ever left her, she would make him pay. But suspicion and proof are not the same. The investigators needed evidence that tied Barbara directly to the crime. And Barbara was careful. She didn't pull the trigger herself. That job had been handed off, filtered through layers of distance. And at the heart of that web stood her lawyer, Manuel Martinez. On paper, Martinez was a legitimate attorney, handling Barbara's legal affairs during the divorce. But behind the scenes, he was something far darker. He was her fixer, her go-between, the man who could make her problems disappear for a price. Detectives followed the trail of money. They dug through Barbara's financial records, piecing together unusual withdrawals and payments that lined up suspiciously with the timing of George's murder. The deeper they looked, the clearer the picture became. Barbara had bankrolled the killing, Martinez had facilitated it, and the hired gun had executed it. The problem was proving it in court. Without the gunman in custody, prosecutors were hesitant to bring charges that might collapse without airtight evidence. Meanwhile, Barbara lived in a strange limbo. Publicly, she projected an image of sorrow, a widow struck by tragedy. She told people she was devastated, that she couldn't believe her husband had been taken from her. But privately, her behavior told a different story. She continued to enjoy her comforts, her shopping, her social appearances. To some, it seemed as though she had shed her role as George's wife, without much grief at all. The police noticed that detachment too, and it fueled their determination to keep digging. George's girlfriend, the woman he had planned a future with, was crushed. In interviews, she described their relationship as loving and full of plans. She spoke of how George had promised her a new life, free from the bitterness of his failed marriage. Now all of that was gone, stolen in seconds by 3 bullets. She sat in the courtroom during early hearings, eyes filled with both anger and grief, determined to see justice done for the man she had loved. For George's children, the pain was complicated. They had grown up with Barbara as their mother, seen her in the role of caregiver, provider, even if flawed. Now they had to confront the possibility that she was the architect of their father's death. It tore them apart inside. Betrayal doesn't begin to capture what it feels like to realize the person who gave you life may have taken the life of the one you loved most. Despite the mountain of suspicion, Barbara seemed untouchable for years. The case stalled, gathering dust as prosecutors waited for the right moment, the right evidence. Barbara carried on, aging into her 50s and 60s, living with the knowledge of what she had done, perhaps believing she had escaped punishment. But the shadows of George's death never left her. Detectives refused to close the file. Every lead, every rumor, every small piece of evidence was added to the puzzle. And then came the break. Investigators eventually traced enough financial links to Martinez and to the hired killer that they were able to build a stronger case. Witnesses who had once stayed silent began to talk. Old records, once overlooked, revealed connections that were undeniable. Slowly, the net around Barbara tightened. In 2010, 2 decades after George's murder, Barbara was finally arrested. For some, it felt surreal. The glamorous woman who had once glided through Manhattan's elite circles was now standing in handcuffs, facing the very thing she thought she had evaded. The tabloids returned to the story with renewed energy. Black Widow of New York, they called her. A nickname that would stick. A label that captured both the glamour and the darkness of her role. The arrest was a moment of vindication for George's family. His children, his girlfriend, his friends, those who had waited so long, finally saw a path toward justice. But the pain of the years lost, the birthdays missed, the milestones George never lived to see could never be erased. For them, Barbara's arrest was necessary, but it was also a reminder of how long it had taken. As Barbara sat in jail awaiting trial, she faced the collapse of the life she had fought so hard to preserve. The designer clothes, the wealth, the social standing, all of it meant nothing now. She was simply an inmate, a number in the system, her future shrinking before her eyes. The irony was cruel. She had arranged George's murder because she couldn't face losing her lifestyle. But in the end, that choice left her with nothing but prison walls and decades of regret. When the case finally reached the courtroom, Barbara's carefully crafted image crumbled. The prosecution laid out the story in chilling detail. They described how she had conspired with her lawyer, how money had changed hands, how a hired killer had stalked George before gunning him down. They painted Barbara not as a grieving widow, but as a calculating conspirator, someone who chose greed over humanity. The defense tried to soften her image, portraying her as a woman pushed to desperation, a victim of abandonment, but the evidence was too strong. The paper trail, the testimony, the years of suspicion, all converged into one undeniable truth. Barbara had orchestrated her husband's death, and then came the moment that stunned even those who had followed the case closely. In 2012, Barbara pled guilty. She admitted her role in the conspiracy, finally acknowledging what investigators had suspected all along. The courtroom fell silent as the reality settled in. For more than 20 years, she had lived with the secret of what she had done. Now, at last, she had spoken it aloud. The judge handed down a sentence of 12 to 36 years in prison. For Barbara, who was already in her 60s, it might as well have been a life sentence. She would spend her final years behind bars, stripped of the wealth and glamour she had once fought so hard to protect. But even with the sentence, questions lingered. What had Barbara truly felt in those years after George's death? Did she ever regret it? Did she ever grieve? Or was she simply consumed with holding on to her identity, her pride, her money? Those questions may never be answered. What was clear, though, was that George's story had become something larger than a single crime. It was a warning about greed, about betrayal, about how love can curdle into something deadly when power and money are at stake. The investigation dragged on through the 1990s and into the early 2000s. George's family had been shattered by his murder, and though Barbara was never formally charged in those first years, the suspicion never left her shadow. Friends, colleagues, even strangers in Manhattan's elite circles whispered about the woman who had everything and yet still wanted more. Detectives believed Barbara was the mastermind, but proving it required patience. The hired gun had vanished into the underworld. The lawyer who brokered the deal was cunning and evasive, and Barbara herself lived carefully, hiding behind expensive lawyers and the walls of privilege. But justice has a way of catching up. In 2008, the lawyer who had been Barbara's accomplice finally faced trial on unrelated charges, and cracks began to appear in the old frozen case. Witnesses who had been too scared decades earlier were willing to talk. Documents were unearthed, bank transactions revisited, testimony reconsidered. Prosecutors built their case piece by painstaking piece, and Barbara, who had once walked free and untouchable, found the net tightening. By 2010, Barbara Kogan was arrested. The woman who had lived in luxury, who had once been draped in designer gowns and diamonds, now wore handcuffs. The trial that followed stripped away the glamorous facade and laid bare the truth. This was not a crime of passion in the heat of the moment. It was cold, calculated, transactional. A contract killing orchestrated by a wife who refused to lose. The prosecution painted Barbara as greedy and vindictive, unwilling to accept a divorce that would reduce her power, unwilling to see her husband happy with someone else. The defense tried to soften her image, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 2012, Barbara pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder. The courtroom, after so many years, finally heard the words everyone knew deep down to be true. George's death had been no random act. His own wife had orchestrated it. The judge sentenced her to a prison term of 12 to 36 years. Barbara Kogan, once the glittering queen of Manhattan society, was now just another inmate serving time behind bars. The impact of George's murder rippled far beyond the courtroom. His children, who had lost a father in such a brutal, senseless way, grew up knowing their own mother was responsible. Friends who had admired the couple for their wealth and apparent sophistication were left with the bitter truth that sometimes the most polished marriages hide the darkest betrayals. The case became a chilling reminder of how greed and resentment can twist love into something monstrous. Barbara earned the nickname the Black Widow of New York. It stuck because it fit so perfectly. A woman who lured with charm and privilege, but whose actions revealed a cold, venomous heart. In prison interviews, she sometimes hinted at regret, but many believed it was too little, too late. For George, there was no second chance, no escape from the betrayal that cost him his life. And so, the story of Barbara and George Kogan lives on as one of New York's most infamous tales of love, money, and murder. A husband gunned down in broad daylight, a wife who couldn't bear to lose her grip on wealth, and a family forever scarred by a decision born out of greed. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to share it with others who follow true crime stories. Hit that like button to support the channel, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the cases where love, power, and betrayal collide.